Darren Sherkat majored in sociology at the University of Tulsa, graduating in 1987. He then completed his PhD in 4 years at Duke University and took a position in the sociology department at Vanderbilt, where he remained from 1991 through 2001 as an assistant and then associate professor of sociology. In 2001, he left Vanderbilt for Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, where he has served as chair of the sociology department several times. He has published extensively on the sociology of religion and contributed a memorial essay to the website in honor of his friend and colleague, Alan Miller, when Miller died at the end of 2002. This article, published at about the same time that he was losing his friend Alan Miller, considers religiosity of people viewed through the lens of their sexual identities, not just whether they are male or female in physiological terms, but also their sexual preference for same-sex or different-sex partners. His analysis may not resolve the nature versus nurture debate on determinants of religiosity, but the way he formulates his research question brings these issues into clear focus for us to think about. A considerable body of research has made it abundantly clear that no matter how we measure people's involvement with organized religion, women seem to emerge as more religious than men. How are we to understand this fairly strong and persistent pattern? Why are women more religious than men? Broad categories of explanation have emerged, and each of them stresses in one way or another that this greater religiosity results in some way from women's experiences in social settings. Some research concentrates on how children learn what it means to be a girl or boy, what girls or boys are supposed to be like. Even in cases when they are not being brought up actively within any certain religious tradition, children are learning gender roles. Researchers who pursue this line of study emphasize that attitudes and behavior that we expect from little girls fit in better with the activities of organized religion than do attitudes and behavior that we expect from little boys. Other scholars look instead at women's situations as adult participants in a society and come to a similar conclusion. Women's greater responsibility for the daily lives of their children means that when it comes to explicitly religious socialization of those children, women will be more often and more directly involved in those activities. This amounts to looking again at the childhood socialization explanation, but this time reversing the binoculars through which we study it and examining the adult socializing agents rather than the children themselves. Within the framework of this established research, Darren Sherkat adds the important distinction that sex is not the same thing as gender. Sex distinctions between male and female refer to biological differences in people's bodies. Gender differences refer to patterns of attitudes and behavior learned and sustained in social interactions. Although gender patterns do tend to correlate with physiological sex of individuals in any society, specifics of how gender roles link to male versus female vary in remarkable ways from one human society to another. Even within a given society, both men and women display a range of attachment to masculine or feminine attitudes and behavior. Sherkat explores one specific example of this variation in gender roles within American society: a person's expressed preference for sexual partners. Men who prefer other male partners and women who prefer other female partners both are reversing fundamental societal expectations. Does such variability in sexual preference have any effect on the religiosity of these people? Most major religions around the world take a dim view of same-sex preferences. This may be a holdover from earlier times when every society faced higher death rates. We had to create strong compulsions to get busy and have lots of babies so that society would survive. This ancient demographic challenge meant that every surviving society has been selected for its ability to brainwash its population into producing and bringing up children as life's most important activity. In today's lower mortality world, that pronatal brainwashing has become a liability instead of a strength, making room for more variability in gender roles. But world religions are holdovers from that earlier era, and their teachings still strenuously encourage heterosexual attitudes and behavior. People uncomfortable with traditional gender roles therefore automatically will feel uncomfortable with traditional religion. Both men and women with same-sex preferences should be less interested and involved with organized religion than their heterosexual peers. Sherkat finds this prediction of alienation from religion for both gay men and lesbian women appearing in lots of existing sociological studies. He has some reservations about this literature, though. Before the late 20th century, when lots of new evidence from sample surveys allowed us to study the entire population, discussion of religiosity for people with same-sex preferences usually centered on intellectual elites. Many of the writers who pioneered new ideas about gender roles were women, giving an impression that even lesbian women were still more in tune with spiritual questions, even if they might be promoting controversial changes in the way we look at such questions. Gay men, on the other hand, were not writing as many of the books. Scholars tended to look at them as mostly interested in the wild and crazy lifestyles that could be lived outside the traditional heterosexual rules, not so much concerned with spiritual things. Thus, you might say that the conventional wisdom, when Sherkat wrote this article a generation ago, tended to look at sex and gender preferences as additive components of religiosity. Women were more religious than men. At the same time, people who preferred different sex partners found support from traditional religion, while people who preferred same-sex partners found disapproval from traditional religion. So people with same-sex preferences were less religious. Add these two effects together, and you get an expected pattern of outcomes described here as Model 1. The most religious people in society should be women who prefer male partners. They should be more religious than the heterosexual men because, well, men, after all, are men, aren't they? They should also be more religious than the women who prefer same-sex partners because the lesbian women will be getting all kinds of negative messages from traditional religion that will tend to drive them away and make them less religious. The least religious of all in this additive model should be the gay men because, well, they too are just men, aren't they? They should have the typical male lack of interest in religion in the first place, and added to that will be the alienating effect of the judgmental messages coming from traditional organized religion. The problem, as Sherkat found it, was that nobody was really looking through the population as a whole to see whether this expected additive model of religiosity fits with observed patterns in society. Apart from the impressionistic talk about intellectual spiritual lesbians and hedonistic, wild and crazy gay men, the few actual studies of this topic by social scientists had concentrated mainly on looking at new religious groups founded by people with same-sex preferences, which seemed to involve more women than men, or on same-sex people struggling to find a place within traditional religious communities. The extent of religiosity among people in the general population, both within and outside organized religious settings, had not really been examined. Since evidence had begun to pile up from public opinion surveys that could illuminate this question, Sherkat decided to go ahead and examine it. When he began his investigation, Darren Sherkat had a pretty clear model of what to expect that he had taken from existing writing about gender and religiosity. This additive model assumes that men are less religious than women, and same-sex couples are less religious than heterosexuals. When you add together these two patterns, the most religious people should be heterosexual women, shown here in red, and the least religious people should be gay men, shown here in a sort of blue-green. Sex differences and gender differences reinforce each other in both directions. What to expect for the cross-classified categories in this additive model is not quite so obvious. On the one hand, heterosexual men, shown here in blue, should be less religious than heterosexual women, but they should be more religious than gay men because the gay men have been put off by the heterosexual message of traditional organized religion. Similarly, lesbian women, shown here in a sort of orange-brown, should be less religious than heterosexual women due to the same messages from organized religion, but they should be more religious than gay men because the gay men are, well, men, aren't they? But who will be more religious, the lesbian women or the straight men? If the sex difference is more important than the gender difference, then the straight men should be less religious than the lesbian women because men are just such dogs in general. But if the gender difference is more important than the sex difference, then the lesbian women should be less religious than the straight men because religion is just so hostile to same sex couples. Sherkat can't sort this one out in advance. We'll just have to throw the dice and see how things come out. All we know for sure is that we should find gay men to be least religious and heterosexual women to be most religious. To find out what was really going on out there in the population, Sherkat turns to our old friend, the General Social Survey, or GSS. Ever since public opinion polling as a science and a business came into its own in the last half of the 20th century, a whole universe of survey data has built up that can give us a window into what Americans in general were thinking and doing. The GSS asks a truly enormous range of questions to a nationally representative sample of the U.S. population every year or two, and this has been going on now for half a century. When he was writing this article, the GSS already had been in the field for nearly 30 years. Sherkat wanted a contemporary picture from his own present time, so he looked only at the decade of the 1990s, including responses from only 1991 through 2000. Starting in 1991, both of the things he wanted to compare began to appear as questions in this survey. People were asked many questions about religion, and he picked out 4 of these to study religiosity. For now, we will focus only on the question about how often people attended religious worship services to see how he organized his analysis. Starting in 1991, the GSS also began including questions about sexual partner preference, so for the decade of the 1990s, he had both sides of the equation he hoped to solve. Another 20 years have passed since Sherkat published this article, so in addition to reviewing his findings, we also will have a look at how things have or have not changed a generation later. For example, GSS responses from the 1990s show that about 2.3% of all male respondents expressed a preference for same-sex partners, but only 1.3% of female respondents expressed such a preference. At the turn of the century, as Sherkat reports, same-sex preferences were nearly twice as common among men as among women, even though these are both very tiny percentages of the total population. 20 years later, based on GSS responses from 2010 through 2018, the share of men expressing a preference for same-sex partners hardly changed at all. The 2.6% figure is not significantly different from the 2.8% figure when Sherkat was working on the problem. But the share of women expressing a same-sex preference nearly doubled from 1.3% to 2.5%, so that by 2020 we can say that this same-sex preference is almost exactly as common among women as among men. This prevalence of same-sex preferences is good to keep in mind when looking at patterns of religiosity. Unfortunately, when we look at Sherkat's data for the 1990s, we have to make a major modification of the simple additive model that he had in mind when he started his research. The question about religious attendance was scored from 0 for never to 8 for several times a week, and Sherkat just calculated the average score on this scale for his groups, separated by sex and gender preferences. As expected, heterosexual women scored highest with an average of almost 4. For the mystery question, lesbian women compared to straight men, the straight men turned out to go to church slightly more than the lesbian women on average, suggesting that the negative messages coming from organized religion had more influence than just the general lack of religiosity of men due to being men. But the greatest disturbance to the additive model appears for gay men. They were not the least religious people in the GSS sample from the 1990s, at least measured in terms of going to church. That prize belongs to lesbian women, who averaged nearly half a point lower than gay men on this indicator. In fact, there's hardly any difference between the average attendance scores of gay men and straight men. The slightly lower average for gay men is not actually statistically significant here. So there is a circular stairway of religiosity in this figure, starting from heterosexual women as the highest and spiraling down clockwise through the 2 categories of men to end with lesbian women as the least religious group in the population. Was this just a historical fluke or a persistent pattern? When we add the decade of the 2010s to Sherkat's original picture, we see pretty much the same result. It is true that everybody goes to church less in the 2010s than they did 20 years earlier, but the ordering of these four groups is still the same. Heterosexual women still go to church the most, but they also reveal the biggest drop from the 1990s. Heterosexual men are still second highest in going to church, and now they are significantly more likely to attend than are gay men. And the lesbian women are still the champions of staying away from religious ceremonies, far below all three other groups. We can conclude pretty decisively that when it comes to actually showing up at worship services, the negative vibes coming out of traditional religion have a stronger effect on attendance for same-sex couples than the old male-female contrast observed in other studies. In fact, precisely because they are less attached to the masculine sex roles that apparently do have something to do with not going to church, gay men actually reverse this sex contrast and are more likely to attend services than are lesbian women. Sherkat's findings remain essentially valid today as they were a generation ago when he first discovered them. The other one of Sherkat's religiosity measures that we will review here asked about how often people prayed. Does a personal, private activity like saying a prayer show the same kind of patterns by sex and gender preferences that we observed for the very public, collective activity of attending worship services? Unfortunately, before we can settle this question, we need to recognize a problem with the results reported by Sherkat in his original article. The General Social Survey, including all the responses to every year's questionnaire, dating all the way back to the first survey in 1972, is now a public resource available for you or me or anybody to study directly on the internet. You can go to the original General Social Survey website, or you can examine the same data using the Survey Data Archive created at the University of California at Berkeley, which offers a very convenient user interface for getting tables of results. If we restrict ourselves to the years from 1991 through 2000, as Sherkat did, we can look at the question asking respondents how often they prayed. The original question coded responses with a value of 1 if a person said several times a day, 2 for once a day, 3 for several times a week, 4 for once a week, 5 for less than once a week, and 6 for never. Sherkat reversed this coding because he wanted the score to be higher when a person prayed more often. So he coded never as 0, up to several times a day coded as 5. If we recode these responses in the same way, based on the original table from the GSS shown here, we get a mean score of 2.78 for men and a mean of 3.56 out of 5 for women. Women pray more often than men, just as we expected, and this difference is statistically significant. But take a closer look at Sherkat's Table 1. The mean values that he shows for his tabulation of this same prayer question, shown in the second row of the table, are all well above 4, closer to 5. According to his coding from 0 to 5, this would mean that all groups of both men and women, regardless of sexual preference, are praying at least once a day on average and often several times a day. This sounds pretty amazingly religious. And in fact, this is one of those rare situations where a calculation mistake has made it into print in a published research article. The numbers shown at the bottom of each column in this Table 1 give the number of respondents on which the calculations are based. You'll see at once that these numbers are a lot larger than the numbers in our table above, taken directly from the original GSS survey data. In fact, this prayer question had a lot of responses during the 1990s that were coded as not applicable. That is, for some reason, lots of respondents, well over 1,000 each for men and women, didn't answer the question. If we take Sherkat's reported coding for this question, from 0 for never praying up to 5 for praying several times a day, and add a code of 6 for these not applicable people, the resulting averages for men and women look a lot like the averages in Sherkat's Table 1. Probably he accidentally coded in all these non-applicable responses with the highest code of all of 6, meaning something like they were praying all day long every day, before he calculated those averages close to 5 that show up in his table. So that row of results is bogus from the start, and so are his conclusions about this prayer question. But if we replay his analysis, we can recalculate our own averages for groups of men and women by sexual preference, and we get results for the 1990s that actually look very much like his findings, just scaled down to a more realistic expected average score on praying. Heterosexual women again get the highest mark for praying the most often, with an average score that works out to praying every day. This time, lesbian women pray slightly more than straight men, even though the difference is not really statistically significant. Gay men appear to be more religious than lesbian women when it comes to prayer, just as they were for attending services, and this time they also appear to pray significantly more often than the straight men. This pattern for the private question of prayer shows a stronger effect for the sex difference between men and women, and a weaker effect, as we might expect, for the negative signals coming from organized religion that might turn off people with same-sex preferences. This makes sense because those negative signals should have less effect on a private matter like prayer than on a public activity like showing up at a worship service. As observed for attendance at worship, the trend between the 1990s and the 2010s reveals a similar shift. However, this shift appears only for heterosexual men and women. The biggest drop in reported prayer appears among heterosexual women, who lost half a point in average scores here, just as they did for church attendance. A much smaller drop appears for the already much lower prayer average for heterosexual men. But the prayer scores for both lesbian women and gay men remain virtually unchanged from the 1990s to the 2010s. For them, nothing changed in 20 years. This itself is a remarkable finding. In their private lives, people with same-sex preferences have gotten closer to heterosexual people in terms of how often they pray, and now we see that gay men are quite close to heterosexual women in frequency of prayer, while lesbian women are very similar to straight men. The averages are reversed for men versus women, but the overall level of prayer is about the same for people who prefer partners of the same or of a different sex. I wonder what Sherkat would say now about this interesting mirror image symmetry.